us in any order?
Good morning. How many of you are in the Brafani with no hot water? No, okay, so some of us are braced this morning, or filthy, one or the other. So we're going to talk about moral panic today. Let me first start with the definition of moral panic from, hold on here. Panic, not finding it. Ashley Crossman. So she defines moral panic as a widespread fear, most often an irrational one, that someone or something is a threat to the values, safety, and interests of a community or society at large. Typically, a moral panic is perpetuated by news media, fueled by politicians, and often results in the passage of new laws or policies that target the source of panic. In this way, moral panic can foster increased social control. So the reason I wanted to have this session is that I think we are living somewhere between the optimism we heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about the last few days and the dystopian view of the world that I think we're seeing from other quarters, especially in media and in politics. And the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Whether or not we have a moral panic underway or whether we're heading to that, we'll find out from our discussion here. But I think that the risks of this are still evident. The risk of doing nothing in the face of a problem is evident, but the risk of doing too much in the face of a problem is another matter. I think we want to look at how bad the problem is, or actually first, what are the problems? Defining what the problems we think are, how bad are they? What are the unintended consequences of taking action? What are the unintended consequences of not taking action? And when we worry about the uptake of technology in society, what are we saying about society? So that's what the topic is today. I will come out running into the room after we begin discussing and talking with all of you in the discussion and seeing how panicked you are or how panicked we can get you or how much we can calm you down. I should note that after this at noon, Jay Rosen isn't here, but there's also another session right up there about anxiety. So if it gets too bad here, you can go to that session at noon. Jillian, do we have a problem? What is the problem? How bad is it or not?
Yes, I would say that we do.
Oh, I'm sorry. We should introduce ourselves.
Yes.
And I'll screw that up too, so why don't we each introduce yourselves going down? Jillian.
Sure. My name is Jillian York. I'm the Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a writer.
I'm Alan Rusbridger. I used to edit The Guardian. I'm now based in Oxford, and I run a college and I chair the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism.
Hi, I'm Tanit Koch. I used to run Bild newspaper in Germany as editor-in-chief, recently quit, and now enjoying my newfound liberty.
I'm Madhav, Chinnappa, and I work on news partnerships at Google.
All right. So, Jillian, problem? No problem.
Yes. So, I mean, I think as many of you did, I watched the Facebook hearings, or at least the first night of them, with a little bit of Schadenfreude. But I think that the problem that we're facing with a lot of these conversations is similar to the one that we're facing politically, which to me is sort of we're in an era of binary thinking. Things are good or bad, they're right or left, they're Trump or, well, I won't go there. And so I think that the moral panic is coming out of this idea of we either have to embrace these technologies and these platforms, or we have to reject them entirely. And so when a few weeks ago the delete Facebook movement arose, my reaction was sort of this, really? This is how we want to treat this? I think that we need to be looking at the middle ground, the third way.
And indeed, Jillian, you at the EFF are a protector of the net, of the net's potential, of the net's possibilities. So what are you protecting it from?
Yeah, well, I think that what are we protecting it from? Overreach on the part of governments, on the part of platforms. I think that there are real concerns here. I mean, I've been pointing them out for a long time around privacy, around free speech, free expression. But ultimately, I think that we have to look at what people want, what people are doing, what they're using, and approach these problems from from the point of view of harm reduction. And so if you're an individual using Facebook, there are a lot of risks that you face doing that, from censorship to having your data snatched up and sold. But I don't think that telling people to walk away is a very viable solution.
Alan, you and I bonded, I think, originally because I respect you as an editor, but we also saw the possibility for the internet for journalism, and I would probably classify us both as optimists. Are you still?
I think so, yes. I mean, the striking thing about the Facebook hearings last week was the sense that the senators asking the questions really didn't understand the subject. So they all asked a very good first question, and Zuckerberg was rather clever in putting the question back and saying, well, I don't fully understand. Can you explain the question? And none of the senators could. And they moved on to the next question. And I think the danger here is that we rush to some kind of solution based on zero evidence and based on a situation that we're all fumbling to understand in some way, including the people who are building this stuff. The most recent example of moral panic in the UK, there's been a spate of knifings. I mean, it's a serious spate of knifings. And the newspapers and the police and the Prime Minister all got it into their head to say that this was all the fault of social media, in the way that in the past they would have said it was the fault of gangster rap or video games or Marilyn Manson. And I mean, social media may play a part, but we don't know, that there is no evidence. And so the danger in what I think is a moral panic is that you rush to regulatory answers that in 10 years, 20 years' time, you're going to regret. So I think we have to give the whole process time.
Tanit, I don't mean to make you speak for your entire homeland, but I might argue that a lot of this started in Germany in the battle against the platforms and in legislation that was passed, most recently the Netzdg law about hate speech. How do you sense, from your perspective in both media and technology, do we have a problem? Was it overblown? Is it underestimated?
I'm not going to do you the favor to talk about the phenomenon of German angst, because I think that's, we got rid of that a couple of decades ago. But yes, I do think there's a problem. We have a multi-billion industry which is hardly regulated at all. And you know me, I'm actually not in favor of regulation. The German approach to all this started much, much earlier than the Netzdg, the latest law which concerns social media. It actually started in the 80s when basically German legislature, the Constitutional Court, invented data protection. And it was interesting to listen to the Zuckerberg hearing, that all of a sudden, even in the US, which sort of looked down upon Europe and Germany for that meddling and God, what are they so worried about, and are now constantly talking about privacy issues. I think that what's worrying me is that if US senators and congressmen do not get the gist of things, how should the general public? I mean, you have the elite there trying to question, and it didn't really grill him, as it sometimes was stated, question Mark Zuckerberg, and they haven't really grasped the matter. So how should society as a whole understand what is happening? I think the problem is that we're faced. Maybe we're not panicky enough, actually, because we're faced with a huge challenge, and it hasn't really entered the general discussion. I'm seriously concerned about the labor market, and the German car industry is really, really important. There are hundreds of thousands of people working there. So if you take an 8-cylinder engine, as we know it now, it's, I think, comprised of 1,200 parts which have to be put together by humans. If you take an electric car engine, 17 parts, and you don't really need many humans to put that together. So these are middle-class jobs, and AI will not just threaten minimum wage jobs, but will threaten lawyers, accountants, radiologists, etc. And I don't see that this challenge is actually on people's minds.
Madhav, You work at a technology company. I often find myself in the position of defending technology companies or trying to build bridges with media and technology companies. So you get the brunt of this often. But I know you, and I know that you have earnest arguments in favor of the possibilities and opportunities, and you also have thoughtful arguments of concern. What's your perspective on what you see going on kind of in the rest of society about what you're in the midst of?
Well, I'm probably going to be a bit boring and kind of agree with almost everything that's been said so far.
Madhav.
And I go back to actually something that you said at the beginning, which is, you know, what are the problems? And if I kind of step back for a second and look at the changes that we're seeing, and these are kind of profound and very, on some levels, very scary changes that are going on through the development of technology. I think that kind of change through technology has always been there through human society. It's actually just accelerating and becoming faster than ever before. So the changes and the questions, and I think we should be asking the right questions. And as you know, as Alan was saying, you know, let's take some evidence-based approach to this, because these do throw up a lot of questions. I mean, from everything from, as you said, you know, as Tanit was saying about jobs and how do we do that, but also I say this as a parent, and I think about screen time for my daughters, right? You know, and these are things that we need to think about. That, you know, my parents never had to really think about screen time for us. Well, they did, but it was television, right? And you know, I'm pretty sure my parents thought I watched too much TV, and I think my daughters are on their phones too much, right? Or phone, to be singular. The 9-year-old's not allowed a phone. But I think we need to ask the right questions, but I would say perhaps not panic, right? And think these through, and to use the T word we were talking about before, think them through thoughtfully, because you don't want to get into the things that were mentioned about unintended consequences and overreaching and binary thinking. I wrote that down. I really like that, because we have an ability, and I think, you know, I'm a news person. I worked at the BBC, and before that at AP. Sometimes we can oversimplify things to get messages across, and that kind of binary thinking can lead you down to some places you probably don't want to go to.
So let's try to catalog the problems, separating out the severity, right? So one is technology and jobs, except for the lawyers. If it eliminates some lawyers, we're all fine with that. But certainly the jobs issue is going to see itself not in the reaction alone to technology, but also in the reaction to immigrants and to trade and globalism. And we see this fear about the future of technology and jobs coming out in all kinds of ways. So this is just one way where technology has an impact. You made reference to your children. We hear an argument that technology is being made to be addictive. I don't buy that, but I am nervous right now that I'm away from my phone, but we'll put that aside. Michael Godwin, he of Godwin's Law, said in a discussion on Facebook about a week ago that he asked people who say that this technology is going to completely change your life. He said, how come it affected 2 billion people but not you? You know, we tend to separate ourselves, but I think there's this issue of our relationship with the technology. What are some of the other issues to catalog that we should be looking at regardless of severity?
I would say the sort of corporate centralization of the ownership of these technologies, the control that companies like Facebook, Twitter, even Google have over our speech, over our data, all of that.
You see, I really like Google. It helps me a lot in my daily life. But I also know that in Germany, Google has, I think, 95% market share. If something isn't on Google, if I don't find it in search, it virtually doesn't exist. So the power, data themselves aren't good or bad, but the question is who controls them and what do you do with them? And if the 5 of us were sitting in the same plane, there's on the same row, there's a very, very high likelihood that we didn't pay the same price. And not just depending on when did we book, but how did we book and how big is the dossier my iPhone, my iPad, my laptop has about me stored somewhere where I can't really see it.
Alan?
Well, I think there are so many things bad about the way these companies behave. You know, I'd love to see them pay more tax. I'd love them to take their responsibilities more seriously. I'd love them to be more open and transparent. I'm doing what Madhav hates, using the word them to describe them all. I suppose I mean Facebook especially. But it is terribly early. So I mean, I don't know what period of time we want to give them. I mean, if they prove incapable of seeing what's happened in the last few months as a wake-up call, then we know, I think, that then the time's come to reach for regulation or more serious measures. But I would be astonished. It would be suicidal of a company now not to be more open, not to be more transparent, not to find a better way of talking to civic society and to journalists. So let's give them a bit of time. Just one question there, because we're I think, focusing very much on Europe and the US, but what about China? What about Russia? You could always abuse intelligence. You didn't need artificial in front of that. And I was surprised to hear Elon Musk say in a documentary, I think a couple of days ago, that he warns about an immortal dictator. So people like Stalin or Hitler, at least they died at some point. But if you create the monster, the artificial intelligent monster, it may not die. So are we actually preparing for what could happen if sort of the not so very good guys, who we I think share the same ethics with in Western Europe or in Europe as a whole and the US, but somewhere across the world, or even somewhere in our countries, do intend to do a lot of bad with what they can do.
So this notion of AI is a proxy for a lot of this fear, because it is the ultimate black box. But it also presents the opportunity to be a solution to so many problems. We heard Zuckerberg say again and again and again, we're trying to train our AI to be able to recognize this stuff. I think there's two parts of that. One is the black box nature. It's a mystery. We don't know how it operates because we all feel stupid next to it. But the other one is the question of scale. I think a lot of what's happening now is that scale is scaring us. And I've said earlier here in Perugia that scale is what provides the opportunity. The scale of the internet provides the opportunity for anyone to speak to anyone the world around. Never possible before. But scale also makes it impossible to monitor that in a way that we're used to in media. So this notion of AI has this future, oh my God, we're creating a new dictator. I'd call that heading toward moral panic.
When it comes from Elon Musk, that's if some, I don't know, what's the word for if some apocalyptic thinker would say that, I probably wouldn't even have remembered it. If it comes from Elon Musk, who is in this business, I think we should at least discuss it.
Well, I think that's the point about trying to be thoughtful about these issues, right? You know, I think that, and again, I do, going back to this, I really like the binary thinking thing. I'm going to keep that one. Right? You know, we do seem to slip into these binary thinkings of, you know, what, AI is going to destroy all jobs, or, you know, it's going to solve all known problems, and those are the two options you got, right? You know, and the reality is, in the beginning, it's going to be something in between. And I think, you know, I always say I'm kind of like I'm the technically dumbest person at Google, right? I'm a news person. But what I see in terms of AI is that the approach, at least that we're taking, is that it's around assistance, right? And it's trying to help you with something. So it's not going to be an end in and of itself. It's going to be something, and that's what technology is. Technology is a way of doing something, right? It's not a be-all and end-all of it. And it throws up all these issues. And you know, jobs is rightly one to consider. There is also, you know, efficiency and automation. And again, going back to the history, if you look at this, you know, that's why the Luddites didn't like machines, right? Because they were worried about how that happens. And societies develop and progress and go into different areas, and jobs are going to move into different areas that they may not have been before. And that's how, I mean, the beauty of that, at least in my optimistic view, is that's how human society evolves. And we're in a stage where we're dealing with these issues, which are profound, and we need to be thoughtful about them to be able to get as much of the right and as much of the harm reduction as we can, because everything is going to be a double-sided sword, right? It's going to be good and there's going to be bad, and we have to try and maximize the good and minimize the bad. But you're never going to eliminate one of those, right? I think that's how we develop.
Jillian, you work among all the technologists. On the one hand, you defend the opportunities they present. On the other hand, you push them to behave better. How do you see the discussion around advanced technologies?
Sure. I mean, most of my experience with it is around what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about the other night during the hearings, the use of algorithms, the use of machine learning and AI for content moderation. So a really specific, narrow issue, but I think it's an interesting one in that when we talk about it, we're talking about jobs, and that's certainly an issue, but Zuckerberg was saying that they're hiring, 20,000, I think, was it? 20,000 more people to deal with the issue of speech, of hateful speech, of other kinds of speech. And at the same time, they're implementing the use of AI for that same purpose. And so on the one hand, you have more people, on the other hand, you have more technology. But my concern there is actually where those two things overlap. Who's training the machines? What are they being taught? And what sort of human bias is being put into it in the first place? And so when you look right now, or historically, at how content moderation has been done, a lot of it comes out of the Philippines. A lot of it is being done by low-wage workers who, and this is, speaking of Facebook, I can't speak to every company, but a lot of it's being done in these places where people are not getting solid training. They don't have the fancy lunches and the dry cleaning and all of the things that their peers in California have. And then who, there's a bias there, and then who's going to actually train the technology to do the same job? And will that same bias come in? Will it be a different bias, et cetera?
What kind of transparency? Because the question that I hear that I hate is, show us your algorithm. You wouldn't know what the fuck to do with it if you got it, right? It's ridiculous. But some measure of transparency behind the principles or the goals, or what are the models of transparency behind machine learning that would be informative and would be helpful to know?
Well, I think instead of being at war with journalism, maybe this is particularly true of the UK, but journalists have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues for centuries. And I think a proper dialogue between journalists who have been used to dealing with these issues of how you tell whether stuff is true or not, so the really basic stuff, and issues around the ethical considerations of journalism, of sources, how you moderate stuff, how you deal with hate speech. I mean, some of these are very new issues, some of these are not new issues. I feel sort of slightly sorry in a way for these companies. There was a sort of look of not quite terror on Zuckerberg's face, but I think it's been a very sobering year for him to move to the kind of scale at which he now operates. It's not an excuse for everything, but it's an excuse for some of it. And I think these people need some help. They need moral philosophers in there. They need journalists and everything in between.
Yeah, I agree. I think. Well, let me ask the question. If tomorrow Facebook came to you, Alan Rusbridger, and said, okay, we take this argument of hiring a high-level editor into our culture to bring to it the sense of public responsibility, what role could you imagine for yourself that would be productive and helpful to both sides inside Facebook?
Well, they keep saying that they're going to do that, don't they? And then they somehow it never works. So I don't know why that is. Is it?
Well, invent the job description that they should do.
Yeah. Well, I think. It would be a lovely job. Yes, please.
Can I just say that at Tanit you're looking for a job, right? So Facebook. If there's anybody from Facebook in the room.
Or Google can always hire Tanit too. Yeah. So we'll get to that. Yeah.
Well, you would stage those conversations, and maybe they're happening within Facebook or not. It's difficult to tell. I've found them a rather opaque and difficult company to have a conversation with, because they tend to field shiny people who smile a lot, rather than have a proper conversation. But they've got to learn to have those conversations, and actually journalists are quite good at hosting those conversations.
Can I make a comment? I think being a news person who's been at a technology company, and you and I have talked about this, is that my feeling is that technology companies have very different cultures, and particularly, you know, Silicon Valley culture is very different, I think, and sometimes quite in a bubble. I think one of the things that Google has learned over the years is that actually we need to open up more, we need to have more of a dialogue and do that, and we've been trying to do that for a number of years now. You know, I can't comment on Facebook, but I think that they're earlier into that process, right? And that's why we created things like the Digital News Initiative and now the Google News Initiative and the other things that we try to do to be more, to do sort of exactly what Alan says there, which is to have that dialogue and collaborate more. And you know, I've said to Facebook myself, I think that they should be doing more of that, because I think overall when we look at these big issues, you know, to be thoughtful about this, you need different sets of voices, different opinions, different things that people won't all agree on, but you need to have that diversity of voices, because it will then get, I think, more educated results from that, rather than kind of very siloed thinking or very, you know, reactive thinking. You know, I think that's the other thing that I worry about in a moral panic, is that people just say, oh, we need to do X, and that's it, and they shut everything down, right? Which, you know, you've seen.
But who would actually say that? We've had a discussion, for instance, about genetics, which I think is overregulated, or genetic research is overregulated in Germany, is less regulated in Israel, and they get better results as we do. But I don't see this sort of running completely out of hand. The trouble I see is that it's actually not discussed enough at all. And the discussion we're having here in Perugia or having on Capitol Hill is largely an elite discussion. And we've seen in the last couple of years what lack of trust in the establishment, in journalism and politics, etc., can do to society, how it feeds into populists, how it helps hyper-partisan movements and parties. And here we have probably the biggest revolution of our lifetime coming up, or we're right in the middle of it. And there is no general discussion about it. So you don't get me wrong, I do see the good, of course, in artificial intelligence. A former colleague lost his wife to cancer because a lab overlooked a tumor marker. Would this happen to a robot? Probably not. Would I like a robot to take over that job? Yes, of course. Does a robot have a more stable hand in surgery than any surgeon? Yes. But would I still love a surgeon to overlook the whole operation? Of course I do. So what you said about who's teaching the machines, I think we all remember the Microsoft chatbot, which learned to be a sexist and racist pig within less than 24 hours by Twitter. So there are, of course, issues for concern. But in Germany, there still is, and I think in the US or Britain, it's a better situation. In Germany, kids still don't have coding classes in school on the level that they have maths classes or chemistry classes. So why is that? Why are we sitting here and discussing this? Why isn't it a general discussion in public?
Alan.
Well, Madhav's right that I think it's easier to have this conversation with Google than with Facebook. But I also, I suppose it's important to say at some point in this discussion, because there's a danger of journalism sounding terribly smug. You know, we can teach them a lot. I think we have to be a bit humble and say they can teach us a lot. I mean, in one conversation I did have with a smiley Facebook person recently, and there was all the usual thing about, you know, you're leeching off journalists and you're taking all our revenues and you ought to. And he just said, well, what? You know, the thing we're struggling to understand is this journalism that you want us to support. What is it? I mean, and in the context of British journalism, that's quite a searching question, because there's an awful lot of, well, not just British journalism, global journalism, there's an awful lot of really bad journalism as well. And I think sometimes having the mirror put back at us would be something useful that would come out of this dialogue.
Amen. Let's talk about media's role in the current, I'll call it a panic. Ellen, I think you and I were around in the earlier days of the web and journalism, and much, maybe perhaps too much, optimism and hope and wonder at it. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but I see in many parts of the media, a dystopian view of technology coming across, that the coverage has gone incredibly negative. Am I imagining that?
No, you're entirely right, and some of that's entirely understandable. It was really nice being a journalist in the olden days. We had a kind of superiority in metaphorically and almost literally. We felt ourselves to be above the audience. We had a monopoly of distribution. We had a monopoly of access to news, a near monopoly, and we almost literally handed down, and that placed us in a very desirable and powerful position. And you can see journalists grappling, thinking at last, maybe we can get back to that position. And to my mind, that's never going to happen. But so I think that in some senses we're seeing the last gasp of a generation of people who, for whom they still hold out this hope that they can get back up on the platform.
Jillian, what's your view of the coverage that you see
Sure.
of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I slid in kind of at the end of the blogging era into this, and so 2008, 2009 was when I started writing professionally. And I think that there's been a generational shift, honestly. I mean, I think a lot of it is when you look at who are the editors-in-chief, yes, of a lot of the sort of popular technology websites now, Motherboard, et cetera. They're millennials. I'm a millennial, and I think that we kind of grew up in this era where technology companies took over from the more distributed platforms. You know, when I first started writing, it was LiveJournal and then WordPress, and so there was a lot more diversity going on, and now everything is centralized and located within these platforms, and I think that we're seeing a backlash toward that, possibly rightfully. Again, not the moral panic, but I think that a lot of the anger is justified.
Madhav, what do you see that frustrates you in coverage?
In terms of the coverage, it doesn't surprise me at all, and it reminds me of, I don't know if it was when I was at the BBC or the AP, I had a senior editor to me said, oh, there's a really simple arc for ongoing stories about things. In the beginning, something is unusual, and either it's kind of cool, or it's cute, or it's weird, and that's how it starts. And then it goes in one of two directions. Either it becomes the best thing ever, or it's the worst thing ever, right? And then no matter what, it has to flip, right? And you see that with you know, and the common thing in the UK was often celebrities. Oh, this person is interesting, then they become, oh, aren't they wonderful? And then you got to knock them down, right? And that's the arc. And it's not, and technology, I think, has gone through that arc in different ways, as has celebrity X or, you know, other issue Y, and it goes through that. So I think we're just doing that, and that kind of saddens me, because again, I think it's actually, it's a bit superficial, and that's what it worries me, if it leads to consequences or actions that are superficial.
What's the media presumption that frustrates you most from your perspective?
It's the one that Alan said, which is that all technology companies are the same, right? And there's a serious point behind that, which is that, you know, they are, you know, if you look at not just Google and Facebook, but Amazon and Apple, and if you add them in there, they are four fundamentally different companies that do four very different things, have four different business models, and I would also say probably have four different philosophies, right? So lumping them all together, and this is the point that I make, which is that if you lump them all together, you actually let them off the hook, right? What you should be doing is being much more nuanced about this and saying, you know, here are the issues that are particular to and you can go beyond the company and say that, yeah, okay, these are for search engines, and these are for social networks, and, you know, these are for, you know, closed operating systems, and these are for, you know, shopping platforms, right? But you need to look at them that way, because mixing them all together, I think, is where I get worried about.
But what they do have in common is that they're largely comprised of engineers. And if you take a bunch of lawyers, that's a more similar mindset than mixed lawyers with sociologists and journalists. And if you have that huge number of engineers, you're totally right, very, very different companies, but still with a mindset of an engineer, which is sometimes extremely helpful and important, but sometimes not, well, helpful enough on its own. I think you do need some outside input. Let me just add one thing to the media coverage. I think this year is the 50th birthday of Space Odyssey, and I can hardly think of any Hollywood movie that has a positive approach to technology. And of course, you want Arnold Schwarzenegger to win, and not that other guy in Terminator. But it is basically apocalyptic thinking, and generations of movie watchers have been trained to be worried about what technology brings to their life, and not been trained to see the good it can also bring.
So let's talk about the presumptions that we make about the public and society in this discussion. Because my fear is, I think that in this Perugia, I'm hearing a desire to return to elitism, right? Oh, good, we're gatekeepers again, because they need us, because they're screwing it up. And my contention of late has been that what the internet really killed is the mass media business model, and with it mass media, and with it the idea of the mass. And that people can now speak and be heard as individuals and members of communities in ways never possible before. But I think that when we say, oh, they're all stupid out there, they don't understand what Facebook is, they don't understand what technology is, they're ruining their lives, they're addicted to it, they elected Trump, we're risking an elitism returning here in this discussion of technology that we think we're smarter than all of them.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it is a bad thing. A lot of the work that I've done over the years has been advocating for the user, and we risk doing that too in my line of work. We absolutely risk the same elitism, don't get me wrong. But in talking with people all over the world, not just in the US, but in all different places, people who've experienced censorship on platforms, people who've experienced censorship by governments, they know more than the journalists a lot of the time, honestly. They've experienced it. They have, this, and watching the hearings the other night really, kind of hit home for me, because I was thinking, wow, like, I'm not sure that Mark Zuckerberg or these senators know what they're talking about. I was thinking, wow, I could explain content moderation better than the CEO of that company. Like, that's terrifying to me. So I think we need to move away from elitism, and I think we need to recognize that the users of these platforms, or internet users, or whatever you want to, people, know what they're doing, and we don't need to save them from themselves. We don't need to save them from these companies, but what we do need to do is build those bridges, connect people to the companies, and everyone needs to be listening a little bit better on every side.
Anyone else on the view of the public?
Well, I think it's quite interesting, in the context of Trump and Brexit, and other populist movements that the so-called liberal elite, that's me and you, are chastised for not listening to these people. Yet often the newspapers who say that are the ones who have started to turn off comments underneath the articles and say, well, that was an experiment we tried, but actually they're horrible. Our readers are morons, it turns out, and we don't want to hear from them, and we certainly don't want to engage with them. And I think this is why journalism is getting quite a lot wrong at the moment. It's still operating in this vertical world, and it can't get a hold of this horizontal world, and it doesn't really want to engage with it, certainly on their own platforms. Journalists keep getting the prediction business hideously wrong, which is not a good look for journalists, to be wandering around saying, sorry, I got that election wrong, sorry, I got that referendum wrong, sorry, we'll try harder next time. But there's now a disconnect between what journalism is trying to do and this business of not really wanting to hear from readers is a small symptom of that.
Tanit, at Bild, you spoke for and to and served the common man and woman, right? As a boulevard paper, that's the culture and worldview of that. And we should note, in Germany, there have been very interesting experiments at Die Zeit. They did Deutschland spricht, where they had people who disagreed with each other, 14,000 of them, meet one day in June and talk to each other. And then you, at Bild, were going back to your hometown and going back to try to meet the people in a way. What's your perspective of the common person in all of this?
Well, there isn't the common person, but I think there is a lot of bigotry around in journalism. Just to add to what Alan said, yes, a lot of media companies turned off the comment section because we didn't want to afford, or some couldn't afford, the amount of monitoring going on. Where do we send the people to? We send them to Facebook. And now we are all complaining about all that amount of hate speech going on in the Facebook comment section. Because what is happening there on a much, much larger scale is what we've seen happening on our comment platforms. Only that Facebook can't turn that off, or can't say, okay, from 11 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning it's just trolls and idiots around, and we'll turn off Facebook. With Bild, we did a 7-week tour through the country before the German general election, and it was fascinating because, you see, we love talking about filter bubbles and, again, blaming Mark Zuckerberg for the filter bubble, whereas Berlin Mitte, the central part of Berlin, where the parliamentary quarter is in itself a huge filter bubble without the help of Mark Zuckerberg. So I think Tom Wolfe said that the failure of American journalists to predict Trump's victory is one of the biggest failures after the financial crisis, which we also didn't predict in the history of journalism, whereas the colleagues from New York and Washington would have only had to go out and travel the country for a couple of weeks to see what was actually going on. And what we realized was going on was that, for instance, the refugee topic was still on sort of top of the agenda, whereas it wasn't discussed in politics. So as I said, I fear that the discussion we're having about sort of technological challenges is largely one led by the tech companies, some journalists, not enough politicians actually, because they don't seem to really grasp it, and they too often think in their electoral term, and you don't win elections on topics like that. But apart from all the good technology is bringing and the challenges for bad it could also bring, I think we shouldn't forget that actually talking to each other, as simple as it sounds, on an eye-to-eye level, is essential for our job in journalism, and I think has been neglected too much during the last decades.
Can I just make a small comment on comments, right? Which is, talking about moral panic and unintended consequences, but in different countries they have different laws about liability of news organizations about comments in their comment section. And I would say that's probably been, and the kind of cost of moderation has been probably the majority, it's been that's been the majority reason that people have shut down comments, right, in a number of places. Because you had a law that made them liable, you had to bring in moderation, that was quite expensive to do at scale, and so therefore the simpler option was to just shut it down. And again, I think that's not good for public civic discourse, and that's kind of an unintended consequence of a law.
But I would also say, to Jillian's point, we are in very early days, we're still reinventing this. When Facebook said recently that they wanted to shift to meaningful interactions between people, I responded and said, okay, good, but A, I'd say meaningful interactions among people, it's not one-on-one, and number two, I fear that we're going to switch from clickbait to comment bait. That engagement, attention, those are the metrics we use now, and that's still media-centric and it's still limited in its definition of community. I think there's a lot of invention yet to be done in how the internet enables people to gather as communities and then to build bridges among them. And I think we have to give time for that to happen. And speaking of building bridges, I'm now going to come out in the room. Questions, arguments, fears, anything at all. I'll run the mic. I'll run the mic. I like doing this. I like to be
Yeah,
Oprah Winfrey, an American reference. Please identify yourselves when you talk.
Tomasz Kellner, I'm here from GE Reports. I had a question for Alan. Alan, you mentioned the demise of the editor-in-chief, but isn't a danger, the reason why we're talking about moral panic, that as editor-in-chief is going to be replaced by an algorithm, something that you just mentioned about the news feed, that it's actually going to be a piece of a code that's going to decide what we're going to read?
The Allen algorithm, yes.
The acoustic in this room is so boomy. Oh. I heard something about editor-in-chief, and then I didn't hear anything more.
I think it was. Is the algorithm going to replace the editor? Is that the?
Yeah, basically the demise of the editor-in-chief.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The algorithm going to replace it. What does that look like?
Yeah. No, I'm against that. No, but I think the danger is that editors-in-chief and journalists in general are cutting themselves off from the way that a lot of information now moves. We can't see it, but it's happening at a vast scale. And I think the answer to say, well, actually, we're not going to allow that on our platform. We don't want that, and we want to try and return to a position where the editor-in-chief. I mean, if you really want that, you have to think very hard about trust and why anybody would trust me or any other editor-in-chief in future. And that's a very big question that I think journalism hasn't come close to addressing yet.
Bobby.
Thanks, I'm Bobby. We've been talking mostly about fairly open platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google. The one word I've not heard discussed yet is WhatsApp. Coming as I have recently from India, WhatsApp is, if I feel any sense of panic, it's about WhatsApp. It's not really about Google or Facebook. WhatsApp is also where a lot of panic is generated. A lot of moral panic is generated, amplified. WhatsApp also, to some degree, represents what you're talking about, which is this sort of horizontal plane where people are talking to each other, but quite often talking nonsense to each other and sort of cranking up that nonsense, cranking up that panic. Should we be worried about WhatsApp? Is there a way? Is artificial intelligence going to solve that problem? I'd be curious to hear basically anybody in the panel who wants to address this.
So I think it's interesting. I'm curious which cultural context or country-based context you're thinking of, because I know that, you know, I'm sure there are some people in the audience going like, what's that? But that's just the thing that I talk with my friends and family on. And then there are places where you have politicians or other public figures talking in sort of a one-to-many thread. I mean, I think there was, I can't remember exactly where, but there was somewhere recently that the network pretty much almost collapsed on the fact that there was someone sending out such huge threads of messages. And so I find it hard to be concerned about WhatsApp in the sense that it is just a simple platform. Rather, I am concerned about the way that it's being used. And I don't think that, you know, I don't see a technical solution to that. I see a human or a social solution to that, which I understand is a frustrating thing to say, of course, because, but in this case, you know, it's not, I don't see it the same way as I see Facebook or search engine algorithms, in the sense that you have a company that's actually building control and manipulation into the way that we get information. Rather, it's a simple platform that is being used in a certain negative way.
Well, but let's talk about that for a moment,
Sure,
because I think what Bobby is talking about, and I want to hear more from you about what you saw when you were at the Hindustan Times in India, but in Colombia, journalists tell me that WhatsApp was the vehicle by which the peace referendum was defeated, and that there was information being passed around. And the problem that I think Bobby raises is we can't see it. Yeah. And I'm not saying people shouldn't have their private communication, of course they should, but we can see the manipulation. The argument of Facebook is that they didn't do enough to recognize the manipulation that was apparent. Now, I would argue again that scale made that much more difficult than anyone realizes. But at least you could go in and see it. And Zuckerberg said, well, communication is encrypted. We can't read that. We can't see that. Say a little bit more about what you saw in the kinds of things that were being spread on WhatsApp.
Sure. I think part of the problem, if for a second, the reason why those who are doing a lot of the deep thinking about these things are missing out on what's happening in WhatsApp is that they're in countries where WhatsApp is not a big deal, or primarily in the US. We have a lot of these discussions about social media and its impact in the US, but the US is almost unique in that WhatsApp is not a major feature in public life. But if you go outside America, if you go to countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, WhatsApp is far, far more prevalent and much more insidious. Yes, it may be a simple platform, but it is a platform that allows people anonymously to promote the most retrograde and vicious ideas, to communicate hate speech with complete impunity, to create echo chambers, to create communities of basically fellow travelers in hatred, where I think we who are sitting in the US tend to miss it. I certainly missed it. Well, I used to think when I live in New York, from New York, WhatsApp seemed to me simply a way, a slightly more invasive way in which my weird uncle could invade my privacy in a way that, I could turn him off in Facebook, but I couldn't with WhatsApp. But when I went to India, that was an eye-opener. Political movements, religious movements, flat earthers, the Indian equivalent of birthers, all of these people live and thrive in the dark social like mushrooms going wild, in a way that really ought to be terrifying us. They may not have an influence on the US election, but they're having an influence on, it's having an influence in the way that 80% of the world thinks and behaves.
Yeah, just to make a quick comment, which is, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jillian.
I just had a quick question as well. I mean, so I don't live in the US, and I do use WhatsApp on a daily basis, but my question was, how are people getting the numbers to send those messages? Because I think that's the part that's really unclear to a lot of people.
I don't think we fully understand yet. It's self-selecting in a certain way, but it does sort of move out from a small group to a large group very, very quickly. So to give you an example, it's a very simple example, but I had multiple WhatsApp groups because I had to. If you're a journalist operating in some of these countries, if you don't have WhatsApp, you're blind to what's going on. So I had multiple groups, and I would get one, let's say, flat earth theory from one group about some weird pseudoscience that someone was putting out. And within 15 minutes, there was this Chinese whispers phenomenon where the same thing was coming to me from 50 different WhatsApp groups and people saying, have you seen this? And pretty soon, in the next turn of that cycle, each of those different sources was adding a little more to that original and trying to connect it to something else. And 24 hours later, the thing is now this completely different creature from where it had started, where, initially it was, well, so-and-so God-man has come up with the idea of a flat earth, to a day later, a scientist from Oxford University has proven that the earth is flat, and that is the sort of thing that takes place in light speed, and we have unless we're paying very, very close attention, and unless we are part of this part of these 50 different groups, this will go under the radar and yet reach hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, just to make a quick comment on that, I think the Reuters Institute have done some research about the different use of WhatsApp from a news perspective as well. And I think what's really interesting in that is just how the countries are so different. I'm Indian, so I totally get the weird uncle WhatsApp group. Yeah, we have that. But I think it's important for everybody I would commend that research to have a look at it, because it is another channel. It may not be completely relevant in the US or in the UK or in Germany, but it is being used in a different way. And I think that shows the point about the different channels are being used in different ways, and we need to be we need to be understanding that this is happening, and therefore figure out what to do with it.
And Jillian's point is right. It's not the technology that's causing it. It is creating the opportunity for certain agents who are cleverly manipulating. And I think that I was a dogmatic believer in openness in the internet, and the problem with that, I think I saw, and Ed Williams said this recently, we didn't anticipate the bad behavior. So we didn't build in the system sufficiently to anticipate that and then to deal with that, I think. Go ahead.
Just one more quick comment on that. I mean, I think it's also reminiscent of the way that Facebook groups works and the way that it was changed a few years ago. It's very frustrating for me. I end up getting added, because Facebook allowed you to add people to groups without their consent, which is the same thing that WhatsApp does. You can add people without their consent. And so all of a sudden I was being added to racist groups. I was being added to groups that were pretty much just set up to sexually harass people. I mean, this is something that it happens in my Twitter DMs as well. If you have your Twitter DMs open, and a lot of it's spam, and some of it's just pure sexual harassment. And I think that that's part of the problem too, is that a lot of these companies and the people who work at the top of them are not thinking about those unintended consequences. They're not thinking about what it means for people when you add them to a group without their consent.
Right, okay.
Thank you. Dimitri from the BBC. So my question is, or rather comment, is that I'm concerned that us as representatives of Western media largely, we are completely disregarding the situation about the second internet, which is prevalent in Asia. So Tanit, you referred to it. So you know, hundreds of millions of people in China are using something which people in the West are not even aware of. They have their own version of Google, their own version of Twitter, stuff like that. So a court in Moscow just blocked Telegram, a messaging app, this morning, again leading to probably the biggest anti-internet action the Russian government has ever taken in the last few years. So I'm just wondering, what can we do to have that discussion going on in a much more, I guess, how can we take that discussion rather than not only concentrating on the Western social media platforms and others, but actually take a wider view of the Earth or population as a whole, rather than just only concentrating on what's relevant to the West?
Well, I think we have to take the discussion from Wired magazine, where you had that amazing article about social credit, which was eye-opening for me in China, to mainstream media, to get the discussion going in a larger Western audience who doesn't speak. I think there's a language gap, of course, because English is a world language. Chinese is spoken by many Chinese, but we can't. It's a different political system, social system, and then it's a completely foreign language to us, as is Russian to most of us. So thanks to media like the BBC, which have a world service, and other mass media who should sort of dig into that a lot more than they do now, I guess.
I think it's an incredibly important point, and there was a huge moral panic around the time of Snowden and since, in which there was a moral panic then over encryption, and you saw a lot of Western politicians, every time something nasty happens, standing up and saying encryption was a bad thing and must be ended. You really thought these people need to have lessons in encryption to understand what it is. And when we were doing stories about Tor, the onion router, that story itself exemplified, the twin uses of that, a thing built with the aid of the State Department to enable people to speak freely and for whistleblowers to be able to blow their whistles, but loathed by the Pentagon and the intelligence services because other bad things started to happen. But I think you always have to remember the people who value encryption for perfectly good free speech reasons.
I'd also suggest that everybody read the digital news report, which is, covers 36 countries and talks about different uses in different countries, and you can see the differences between countries and how people are using things like WhatsApp or other things like that to just at least be educated about the differences, which I find really fascinating.
I'm back here now.
Hi, Marina Callan from the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. I want to talk about the echo chambers, because technology allows us obviously to target audiences, and audiences sort of almost self-select which news outlets they read and follow. Is it a good thing? Because everybody's sort of blaming mainstream media. It's sort of mainstream media bashing is sort of favorite pastime. But do we need mainstream media to start to try to build bridges? How do we break from echo chambers? Because that's what technology allowed us to do, even more so than before. But please just don't say we need to. We do know that we do. But how do you do it?
Well, some people, I guess, would suggest that, for instance, the readership of the Daily Mail is one big echo chamber. So I think a lot has been going on for much longer than we think now. Same about fake news. I heard an American studies professor from Germany tell a wonderful story about the American election in the 1820s between Adams and Jefferson. And the Adams campaign team was spreading the news that Thomas Jefferson actually wanted to reinstate monarchy in the US and wanted to marry off his children to the British royals. The Jefferson electoral campaign team, however, said that no need to vote for Adams because he's dead. He died. And this at the time was fake news and of course lingered around for days and weeks because there were no mass media, no mainstream media on large scale to counter that, those fake news. I do think that a lot of the concerns are there because we now see what is there. I think people have been having those thoughts for much longer than we realized, and I'm quite thankful actually that because of the internet, because of social media, people like us who aren't or who think they aren't in echo chambers, we all may be in the odd filter bubble ourselves, get confronted with yes, the odd Indian uncle and the flat earthers and the chemtrailers, to be actually able, outside of those WhatsApp groups, to inform the general public.
I want to argue, too, for a moment that one solution to this, I think, I'm going to use this as a very slick transition here, is not only the communities themselves, but also a wider array in the ecosystem of media, and to support more players in media for more communities. And I'm using that as a transition to give a momentary plug here. In full disclosure, this involves the News Integrity Initiative. But this morning, the European Journalism Center announced a major plan to support innovation in media, and I think it goes to that question, and some of you here may want to apply, so I want to give just a moment to Adam Thomas to talk about that.
Jeff, you're a slick operator, thank you. Yeah, so I'm the director of the European Journalism Center, and I've spent the last 2 years touring Europe, and I think one of the solutions to this type of work is to empower newsrooms that are putting communities and their conversations really at the heart of fixing this problem. It's something we're super passionate about, and Jeff is as well. So we've launched this morning an Engaged Journalism Accelerator. It's a 1.7 million euro fund, extensive coaching, grants and events that are going to spread across 47 countries in Europe. The News Integrity Initiative are a super generous partner of this, and what we hope to do is really empower newsrooms that are putting communities, conversations at the heart of not just their editorial, but also their revenue strategies as well. We're also excited to announce that Civil are going to come on board as a partner for this. Civil are, I think, providing a really interesting opportunity for technology to play a role here, but they also share the same type of vision as well. So Daniel, maybe you want to say something.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. Hey, Madhav.
Hey, Daniel.
I'm Daniel Sieberg. I'm a co-founder at Civil and lead our business development. I want to thank Adam and the EJC and the News Integrity Initiative for being such thoughtful partners in this. We are a scrappy startup. We are trying to build a decentralized platform for sustainable journalism through blockchain technology. I haven't heard blockchain mentioned here yet today, but we think that there's an opportunity through blockchain to help allow this kind of openness and transparency. I think it plays a lot into, or we think it plays a lot into this idea of the sort of morality panic that's been talked about here today. And we're excited to see what's going to be fostering here in Europe as a result of this fund. So thanks, Adam, and thanks, Jeff.
Thank you for your indulgence with that plug for NII, but I think it's good work that some of you may want to talk to them, and they're right over there. So, I appreciate the thoughtful, nuanced, calm discussion we in fact have had. I think there are earnest issues to deal with, but I still worry. I'm still panicking about the panic. I still worry that we could go overboard and we could end up with legislation and regulation that limits the opportunities that we have. Any closing thoughts from any and all of you?
Well, I think I would say again, forgive me, I'm kind of agreeing with everybody here. I think we need to be absolutely cognizant of both ends of these spectrums, right? So that we can actually get to something in the middle. And I think we need to be talking much more. We need to be, and I say this from a Google perspective, Google needs to be listening much more. So I'll shut up very soon. But I think that also we need to be having that dialogue with the legislators as well, right? You know, if as Tanit was saying, and I think Jillian was saying as well, if you learned one thing from at least definitely day one of Mark Zuckerberg's testimony, it was that sometimes the legislators may not know enough, if I'm being polite. And we need to be very, that's the thing we should be worried about. And and to combat that, I think we need to have a better dialogue, right? And we need to help and discuss and talk this all through rather than take that kind of binary thinking that people are getting into.
I think I've always had difficulty with the term morals himself, not because I was a tabloid editor, but because if you think back about the morals of the 1950s, is that something relevant to us now? What about in 50 years' time when we look at the morals of today's society? I think the questions we should ask are fundamentally ethical, and they're still not answered, and it's even unclear who's answering them. So I'd hope for a democratic process of answering those fundamentally ethical questions we've raised here today.
I'm not going to put Madhav on the spot to answer his own question, but I'll ask you, are legislators educable?
Yes, I think they are. And I think we should give them credit. The problem with legislation at the moment is that, again, talking for Germany, we still have legislation going back to the times of the German Empire with copper wires into the country. If you look at telecommunications industry, they're begging for a modernization of legal system to adapt to not even AI, the AI age, but to the digital age. So there's just, and I think we're not fast enough in keeping up with the technological changes.
Just to sort of answer the question, I think they definitely are, but it's not a one-way thing. And actually, I think it's about creating a process where you have a discussion over this. Because I think, and like I said, I totally love the binary thinking, but I think sometimes the dialogue happens in a very binary way, right? And so actually, and I don't know what the solution is, but I hope that there is a process that you can have the discussion in a non-binary fashion, not kind of, argue this outcome versus this outcome, but but discuss the issue.
Which should be convened by the likes of journalism and academic institutions. Alan.
Three things. One is this point. I don't think legislators are ready to legislate yet. They don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And that goes for a lot of the rest of us as well. So we all have to raise our game in trying to understand it, but particularly if you're going to legislate, you have to understand this stuff much better than they do at the moment. Second is we have to have evidence. This discussion about echo chambers, there's lots of evidence that says there's no such thing as echo chambers, that actually people are much more exposed to proliferation of sources than before. So we don't actually have the evidence on which to base the discussion that might lead to legislation. And the third thing is it's evidently some of these companies have got to change, and they have to convince us that they're changing. And they have to realize that they have moved from being tech companies to being intrinsic parts of society and how society now operates. And that's a profound shift. And I guess they need to convince us that they realize that. That was it. Yeah.
All right, recommendations for 3 different groups. I think that as a society, we need to start asking different questions from the root. What kind of internet do we want? Who do we want to have control over these things? What sort of spaces do we want to engage in? I think companies need to shake things up a little bit. Mark Zuckerberg's been in his position for too long. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me on that one, but it's time to step aside, let some new blood in. But I mean, more than that, I think, open up their ears, listen, and that. And then lastly, I think that when it comes to journalism, I think, again, with asking these questions, I think journalism got on some of these questions that we're talking about now a little bit too late. I think that civil society was talking about some of these issues of control 10 years ago. I couldn't get a piece placed, and now, they're demanding them. And so 10 years ago, it was really difficult, and it wasn't just me, it was other people too, of course. But it was really difficult to ask some of these questions. It was difficult to put in these pieces that say, okay, do we want companies to have this much centralized control? Now we're asking them, it's a bit too late. And so I think there's really change for everyone to make.
Yesterday, at the end of this session, I pointed out, when was this building built? Does anyone know? 1273. Now you know. Matthew pointed this out, right? So Gutenberg's printing was invented in approximately 1450. And it sobers us, I think, about where we are in this progression. My argument at the end is, it is too early to panic. We are still making this thing of the internet. We don't know what it is yet. We still see the future in the analog of the past. And when printing was popularized by Gutenberg and company, Erasmus feared what books would do to the human mind and called them paper bullets that would destroy our thinking. I think we see similar talk today. We see similar talk through the days of the telegraph. I just found out that the reason Madhav is ruined is because he has 4,000 comic books, and we know what comic books do to young people. We've gone through many kinds of panics that in the end are fundamentally insulting to the public. In the end, the question is, do we have faith in our fellow men and women that we will figure this out? I still do. Thank you very, very much for coming out.